The moment Peter Dawson walked into the general store with a 7-year-old girl on his hip and flour on his shirt, and a look in his eyes like a man who had been treading water for so long he had forgotten what dry land felt like, everyone in Caldwell, Kansas knew that something was about to give. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead on a string, dusty and loud, and full of cattlemen and dreamers, and people who had run out of somewhere else to go. The wind came off the plains with a kind of relentless patience, bending the prairie grass flat, rattling the wooden signs above the storefronts, and carrying with it the smell of cattle and distance. It was a good town, mostly, the kind with a church and a schoolhouse and a sheriff who did his job, but it was also a town where a man could disappear into his own troubles without anyone noticing for quite some time. Peter Dawson had been disappearing into his troubles for almost 8 months. His sister Ruth had died in July of the previous year. Fever, the kind that came on fast and left no room for argument. Her husband, a cattle drover named Cal Whitmore, had ridden out with a herd north of Dodge City 3 weeks before Ruth took sick, and by the time word reached him, Ruth was already in the ground and little Clara Whitmore was sitting on Peter's porch wrapped in a quilt that was too big for her, holding a corn husk doll and not saying a single word. Clara was 7 now. She had been 6 when her mother died and had spent the better part of the past 8 months either crying or silent, with very little in between. She would not eat anything that was green. She had nightmares that left her screaming until Peter stumbled down the hall half asleep and sat on the edge of her mattress and rubbed her back because he did not know what else to do. She had started a habit of pulling the buttons off her dress whenever she was anxious, which meant Peter had spent more time with a needle and thread than he had in the entire previous 30 years of his life. Peter was 31. He was a decent man by most measures. He ran a small horse ranch just east of town, the kind of operation that kept a man busy but not prosperous, breeding and breaking horses for trail drives and selling them to passing outfits. He was broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of hands that looked like they had done real work. He was not a man who talked much, which had served him fine when it was just him and his hired hand, a wiry old fellow named Deke Hartwell who chewed tobacco and had strong opinions about weather patterns. He was not, he had come to realize with a kind of slow horror, built for raising a child. He did not know how to braid hair. He did not know how to manage a little girl's grief when he was barely managing his own. He did not know what to say when Clara asked him why her mama had to go to heaven and whether heaven was far away and whether her mama could see her from up there. He gave her answers that felt hollow and watched her accept them with a solemnity that broke something in him every single time. He fed her. He kept her warm. He brought her to school 5 days a week and picked her up again. He sat with her through the nightmares. He bought her peppermint sticks at the general store because they made her smile, and her smile was the one thing in his world that still felt uncomplicated. But he was failing. He knew he was failing. He could see it in the way Clara watched the other girls at school with their mothers, a long, quiet kind of looking that had no complaint in it because she was too young to know how to make a complaint out of grief. He could see it in the way she had stopped drawing pictures the way she used to, filling whole pages with horses and flowers, and now mostly just sat by the window in the evenings and watched the plane go dark. Her father, Cal Whitmore, had sent one letter. It had arrived in November and said he was sorry and that things were hard, and that he thought Clara would be better off with Peter for now, as he was riding cattle and had no way to keep a child on the trail. Peter had read that letter twice and then put it in the stove and watched it burn, because he did not trust himself to keep it without developing a level of contempt for Cal Whitmore that would not serve anyone. So there he was, in late April of 1878, walking into Henderson's general store with Clara on his hip, because she had twisted her ankle on the porch steps that morning and refused to let him put her down, her small arms looped around his neck, her chin resting on his shoulder, watching the store around them with those large, dark, thoughtful eyes that had been Ruth's eyes exactly. He was buying flour and salt and a tin of coffee, and trying to remember if they were out of lamp oil when the bell above the door rang again, and a woman walked in from the stage road with a carpetbag in each hand, a hat that had seen considerable weather, and the particular expression of a person who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay. He noticed her the way a man notices something that is slightly out of the ordinary pattern of a day. She was perhaps 26 or 27, not tall but with a way of carrying herself that suggested she was accustomed to not being noticed and did not much care. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up under that weather-beaten hat. She had a steady, unhurried way of moving, setting her carpetbags down near the door and looking around the store with calm, clear eyes the color of creek water, taking inventory the way a person does when they are practical by nature. Peter turned back to his list and tried to remember lamp oil. It was Clara who spoke first, which was itself unusual enough to mark the moment. Clara, who had not spoken to a stranger without prompting in at least 3 months, tilted her head and said, in her careful, serious way, "Your hat has a hole in it." The woman looked at her, and then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that arrived without any announcement, the kind that was not performing anything. "You are absolutely right," she said. "A branch got it somewhere outside of Wichita, and I have been meaning to do something about it ever since." "My uncle could fix it," Clara said. "He sews." Peter felt a particular sensation in his face that he believed was blood reaching his skin under uncomfortable circumstances. "I sew buttons," he said, without quite meaning to speak. "That is different from hat repair." The woman looked at him then, and there was no particular softness in her look, nor any sharpness. It was direct and entirely without judgment, and that somehow was the most disarming thing about it. "Maude Brooks," she said, as though they had already agreed to introduce themselves. "I am the new schoolteacher. I have a letter from the superintendent here somewhere." She reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope, not showing it to him, just confirming its existence. "Peter Dawson," he said, shifting Clara on his hip. "This is Clara." "Hello, Clara," Maude Brooks said. "Hello," Clara said, and then buried her face in Peter's shoulder, which was more or less her standard retreat from conversation. But she was peeking out again within seconds, which was not standard at all. Peter paid for his supplies and carried them and Clara out to the wagon, and did not think particularly much about Maude Brooks for the rest of that afternoon. He had more immediate concerns. The fence along the east pasture had another post that needed replacing. Deke had found a mare with a stone bruise and was treating it with poultices that smelled like something had gone wrong with a cabbage. Clara needed new shoes and had been growing roughly the way prairie grass grew after rain, which was in fast, inconvenient increments. He thought about her at dinner, though, not in any particular way, just the fact of her, a new schoolteacher, Clara's teacher then. He found himself wondering briefly if she was the patient sort, and then felt slightly foolish for wondering it. Clara ate half her dinner and pushed the beans to the edge of the plate and asked if heaven was cold at night, and Peter said he did not think so, and she said she hoped not because her mama hated being cold, and then she asked if she could be excused and took her corn-husk doll upstairs, and Peter sat at the table for a while after, in the particular silence that fills a house when a child goes to bed, which is both relief and an accusation at the same time. He washed up. He checked on the horses. He stood on the porch for a while and smoked his pipe and watched the stars over the flat Kansas plain and thought about what he was doing wrong and could not name it, which was the worst kind of failing, the kind without an obvious remedy. School started again on Monday. It had been out for a week on account of the previous teacher, an elderly man named Hodgkins, deciding that he had had enough of Caldwell and departing for his daughter's farm in Missouri. Peter loaded Clara into the wagon and drove her to the schoolhouse, which was a low, white-painted building at the edge of town, with a bell on the roof and a flagpole out front. Maude Brooks was already there when they arrived. She was sweeping the steps with a broom, her hat on a nail by the door, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she was talking to two of the older boys who had arrived early and seemed to be explaining something to them with great seriousness while she swept, not stopping one activity for the other, just doing both at once with a kind of easy efficiency. Clara climbed down from the wagon before Peter could help her, which surprised him, and walked up the path toward the schoolhouse. Maude looked up and saw her and stopped sweeping. "Good morning, Clara," she said. "Good morning, Miss Brooks," Clara said, in the soft, careful voice she used with people she was not yet sure about. "I am glad you are early. I need someone to help me decide where the spelling chart should go. I have two opinions about it and I cannot decide." Clara stopped walking and looked up at her. "I could help," she said. "I was hoping you would say that." Peter watched his niece walk up those steps and into the schoolhouse with a woman she had met exactly once and felt something move in his chest that he did not have a ready name for. He sat in the wagon for perhaps a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He came back at 3 o'clock, and Clara ran out of the schoolhouse door with more velocity than he had seen from her in months. She was talking before she reached the wagon, saying that Miss Brooks had read them a story about a girl who went west in a covered wagon, and that she had let Clara hold the book while she read, and that the spelling chart had gone on the south wall because the light was better there, and that Miss Brooks had a whole tin of butterscotch candies on her desk, and you got one if you answered a hard question, and Clara had gotten one. Peter said, "Is that right?" Clara said. "She has a really long braid. She keeps it pinned up, but I saw it when she took her hat off at lunch, and it goes all the way down her back almost." Peter said, "You should eat your dinner tonight." Clara ate most of her dinner that night, which was not entirely connected to the butterscotch candy or the spelling chart or the braid, but was also not entirely disconnected from them either. The change in Clara was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single day or a single week. It was gradual and quiet, the way real changes tend to be, the way the light shifts in spring, not in one sudden burst but in slow accumulations that you only notice when you look back. She began to talk more at dinner. She began to draw again, filling pages with horses and houses, and once, a careful rendering of the schoolhouse with a small figure in the doorway that was, apparently, Miss Brooks, identifiable by what Clara described as her good hair. She still had nightmares sometimes, but they were less frequent, and on the mornings after them she was sad rather than broken, which felt like progress. Peter was grateful. He was also aware, with a certain uneasy clarity, that he was looking for reasons to speak to Maude Brooks. He manufactured one in the second week of May. It was not entirely manufactured. Clara had mentioned that the schoolhouse needed a new coat of whitewash before summer, and Peter, who had whitewash in time on a Saturday morning and a reasonable facility with a brush, appeared at the schoolhouse on that Saturday with both. Maude was there, as he had suspected she might be, arranging books on the shelves along the east wall. She turned when she heard him come in, and he held up the pail and said, "I heard you needed whitewashing done." She looked at him for a moment, steady and amused, and said, "Who told you that?" "Clara. Clara is 7. She also has strong opinions about the south wall getting good light, so I would not dismiss her observations." Maude smiled, which was the thing that was increasingly occupying a particular corner of his mind. Not because it was a spectacular smile, in the way that some women had smiles that were designed to be noticed, but because it was genuine and quick and always slightly surprised by itself, as though she had not quite expected to be amused and was pleased to find that she was. "The north wall does need it," she said. He whitewashed the north wall. She continued arranging books. They talked in the way that people who are not yet sure of each other talk, in careful installments. He learned that she was from Abilene, that she had trained as a teacher there, that she had 3 brothers and no sisters, that she had taken the Caldwell posting because she wanted to be somewhere where the work was needed, which she said plainly and without any pretense of modesty or pride, just as a fact. He told her about the ranch, about the horses, about Clara. She listened when he talked about Clara the way a person listens when they are actually taking in what you say, not waiting to speak but actually hearing it. And when he finished telling her about the nightmares, about the quiet, about the buttons pulled off dresses and the untouched dinner plates, she said, "She is grieving." Children grieve longer than people expect, and they grieve differently. They need permission to feel it and company while they do. "I do not know how to give her that," he said, honestly. "You are giving her more than you know," she said, which was neither flattery nor dismissal but something more useful, the kind of thing you say to someone when you want to correct a misapprehension without making them feel worse for having had it. He went home that afternoon and sat on the porch with his pipe and the lowering sun on the plain and thought about company and grief. He thought about it for quite a while. In the weeks that followed, Peter found himself engineering proximity to Maude Brooks with an ingenuity that slightly embarrassed him when he examined it too closely. He repaired the split fence rail beside the school road because it was a genuine hazard and not because Maude walked past it. He came a little early to collect Clara some afternoons, which meant standing at the door of the schoolhouse and watching Maude at her work in the 10 minutes before she dismissed the children. And this had somehow become the best part of several of his days, which was information he was not ready to do anything with. He was not a man who moved quickly toward anything he cared about. He had learned by some calculus of experience and temperament that the things worth having were worth approaching carefully, and that caution was not the same as cowardice, and he held to this belief with some conviction. He held to it even when Deke Hartwell, who had the social subtlety of a fence post, said one evening over supper, "You have been whistling." Peter said, "I whistle." Deke said, "Not in the 8 years I have known you, you have not." Peter said, "Mind the horses, Deke." Deke minded the horses with an expression of significant private amusement. The evening everything changed in direction, if not in fact, was a Friday in early June. There was a church social, the kind of event that Caldwell hosted roughly once a month, which served a number of purposes, not least of which was allowing the population of a small frontier town to confirm that its various members were still alive and present and accounted for. There were trestle tables with food and a man named Elroy Biggs who played fiddle with more enthusiasm than precision, and children running in the long summer evening light, and the smell of wood smoke and frying salt pork. Peter brought Clara, who had asked to go with a directness that suggested she had a specific purpose in mind. Her specific purpose turned out to be locating Maude Brooks, which she accomplished within approximately 4 minutes of arriving, steering toward her through the crowd with the confidence of a small, serious compass needle finding north. Maude was standing with the minister's wife, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Avery, and she looked up when Clara arrived at her elbow and said, "There you are. I was looking for you." Clara, who had not been looking for Maude nearly as discreetly as she imagined, beamed. "Can I sit with you? I was hoping you would." Peter came up behind Clara and said, "Good evening," and Maude looked at him, and there was a fraction of a moment where something shifted between them, something that was not quite conversation but was not quite silence either, the way weather shifts before it becomes weather, when the air changes pressure and you feel it in your skin before you understand what it means. They sat together for most of the evening, the three of them, with Clara eventually falling asleep in the crook of Maude's arm on the bench, her corn-husk doll clutched to her chest, her dark hair spread out, and Maude sitting very still so as not to wake her, and talking to Peter in the low, easy way of people who have gotten past the formal part of knowing each other. She told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself and had died the winter before. She said it without excessive sorrow, but with a quiet weight that told him it was still recent enough to press on her at unexpected moments. He told her about Ruth, about what Ruth had been like before she was anyone's mother, when she was just his younger sister who laughed at everything and made friends with the horses the way other girls made friends with dolls. He had not talked about Ruth to anyone since the funeral. He had not known he wanted to. Maude listened. She did not offer the usual consolations, the God's plan, and the she is at peace now that people reach for in the absence of anything real to say. She just listened, and when he was finished she said, "She sounds like she was wonderful, and that was all, and it was enough, and it was better than everything anyone else had said in 8 months." He drove home with Clara asleep in the back of the wagon, her doll under her chin, and the stars overhead, and the plane going silver and enormous in all directions, and he thought about Maude Brooks with a clarity that was both entirely welcome and somewhat alarming. He thought, "She has patience I did not know a person could have." Not the performed kind, the kind that is really just delayed frustration, but the actual thing, the kind that comes from a person who has genuinely made peace with the pace that other people move at, who takes children as they are and men as they are, and does not require them to be otherwise before she gives them her full attention. She gave Clara her full attention. She gave him her full attention. It was one of the most disquieting and wonderful things that had ever happened to him. He decided, on the road home, that he was going to do something about it. He did not know exactly what or exactly when, but he decided, with the particular resolution of a man who has been reluctant for just long enough, that he was going to stop engineering proximity and simply be present and see what happened. What happened in the way of things that finally start moving was several things in close succession. The first was that Clara, on the following Monday, had a bad day at school. Not because of anything Maude had done. One of the older boys, a 10-year-old named Will Decker with a talent for unkindness, had said something about Clara's mother that Clara would not exactly repeat to Peter, but that had made her cry in class. When Peter arrived to collect her that afternoon, her eyes were red, and she was holding Maude's hand, and Maude was crouched down on the schoolhouse steps at Clara's level, speaking to her in a quiet voice. When she saw Peter, she said, "Can I speak with you a moment?" And Clara let go of her hand and went to the wagon, and Peter looked at Maude, and she told him, plainly and without dramatization, what had happened. She told him what she had said to Will Decker, which had been a quiet but comprehensive accounting of the consequences of cruelty, and she told him what she had said to Clara, which was that missing someone was not weakness, and that crying was not something to apologize for, and that her mother had loved her, and that love did not go away just because the person did. It stayed in the people who had known them and came out in the things they had taught you, and Clara would carry her mother's love her whole life. Peter stood on those steps and looked at this woman who had known his niece for barely 6 weeks and had just said the thing he had been trying and failing to find for 8 months, and he said, "Thank you," and his voice came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him and said, "She is going to be all right. She is stronger than you know. She is more like her mother every day," he said. Maude said, "Then she has something very good to grow into." He helped Clara into the wagon and drove home, and that evening Clara drew a picture of her mother from memory, the first time she had done that, and showed it to Peter, and he looked at the careful rendering of Ruth's face and said it was very good. And Clara said Miss Brooks had said it was a good thing to draw people you loved so you could remember them exactly. And Peter looked at that picture for a long time after Clara went to bed. The second thing that happened was a Saturday at the end of June that started ordinarily enough, with Peter at the ranch working through the morning, and took a different direction around noon when one of his mares foaled unexpectedly early. The foal was small and the mare was exhausted, and Peter spent 2 hours sitting in the straw with them, making sure everything was going to be all right. Clara had been at the ranch for this, and her eyes were enormous the whole time, watching the mare and the foal with a concentration that briefly displaced every other thing in her world. When it was clear that both would survive and thrive, Clara said, "Can we name her?" Peter said, "She is a sales horse, Clara." Clara said, "But can we name her anyway?" He said yes. Clara thought about it with great seriousness for approximately 4 minutes, and then said the foal should be named Buttercup. Deke, who had been trying to look like he was not listening, made a sound that could have been a cough. That evening, Peter drove into town to get the mail, and on the way back he passed the schoolhouse and saw a light inside, which was unusual for a Saturday evening, and he stopped the wagon. Maude was inside grading papers, a lamp on the desk, a cup of tea gone cold beside her. She looked up when he came in. "You are here late," he said. "The weeks go faster than I expect," she said. "I always think I will catch up, and then I do not." He looked at the papers on her desk and the books stacked around them and the lamp turning her face warm and the way she looked when she was at work, which was fully herself in a way that people sometimes only are when they think they are alone. He said, "Clara named the new foal Buttercup." She put her pen down and laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded and full, and it did something to the atmosphere of the room that no amount of lamplight was responsible for. She said, "That is entirely right. That is exactly what you name a foal." He said, "I am going to regret it in April when I am trying to sell a horse named Buttercup to a cattle outfit." She said, "You could tell them she was named for her coloring. She is mostly gray." She laughed again. He stayed for another hour, sitting on the edge of a student's desk while she finished her grading, talking intermittently about nothing consequential and everything that was. She told him about a letter from her brother in Abilene that had made her homesick in a way she had not expected. He told her about Deke's ongoing theories about weather and their consistent inaccuracy. She said she thought there was something admirable about a man who kept theorizing even when the evidence did not support him. He said he thought there was something exhausting about it. They disagreed pleasantly about this for a while. When he finally stood to leave, he stood for a moment more than was strictly necessary, and she looked up at him from her desk with those steady, clear eyes, and he said, "I am glad you came to Caldwell, Miss Brooks." She said, "So am I, Mr. Dawson." There was a pause that was approximately the length of a decision, and he chose not to make it yet, but it was close, and she knew it was close, and he knew she knew, and he walked out into the warm Kansas night and stood beside his wagon for a moment feeling something very much like the edge of something good. He told Deke about none of this. Deke had already been insufferable about the whistling. July came in hot and dry, the way Kansas Julys do, the kind of heat that flattens everything by midday and sends the cattle to whatever shade exists. The ranch work was heavy. There was a drive coming through and Peter had horses to deliver, which meant a full week of pushing hard with Deke and a temporary hand named Cord Fletcher who arrived from Wichita with good references and an easy manner and spent most of his spare time reading, which made Deke treat him with the particular suspicion reserved for the unpredictably different. Clara stayed with Mrs. Avery, the minister's wife, during the long days, and Maude came by in the evenings twice that week to sit with her, which Peter did not know until he came home the second evening, and found Maude and Clara on the porch together, Clara in Maude's lap, being read to from a book about explorers that Maude had brought from the schoolhouse. He stood at the gate for a moment before either of them saw him. Clara's head was tipped back against Maude's shoulder. Maude's arm was around her. The sun was going down behind the barn, and the light was that particular gold that July evenings do in Kansas, thick and warm, and the sound of Maude's voice reading about rivers and mountains came to him across the yard, and he felt, with a completeness that was almost physical, that he had been missing this without knowing what it was. Clara saw him first. She said, "Uncle Peter, Miss Brooks is reading about Lewis and Clark. Did you know they went all the way to the ocean?" He came up the path and said, "I had heard something like that." Maude looked at him over the top of Clara's head and said, "I hope this is all right. Mrs. Avery mentioned Clara had been asking about the book." He said, "It is more than all right." She stayed for supper. He cooked what he had, which was not extensive, salt pork and biscuits, and the green beans from the garden that Clara had decided tonight she would make an effort with. Maude ate everything without comment on its simplicity and talked to Clara about Lewis and Clark and their dog, a Newfoundland named Seaman, which interested Clara enormously. After supper, Clara drew a picture of the dog, and Maude admired it with the specific, honest enthusiasm of a person who actually meant it. When Clara had gone upstairs, Maude and Peter sat on the porch in the cooling dark, the last light gone from the horizon, the plain breathing slowly around them. He poured them each a small glass of the apple brandy he kept for occasions that warranted something more than water, and they sat for a while without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. He said eventually, "You did not have to come." She said, "I wanted to." He said, "She needs someone like you." She said quietly, "What about you?" The question sat between them for a moment, not accusatory, not demanding, just placed there for him to look at. He said, "I expect I do too." She looked at him in the dark, and then she looked back at the plane and she said, "I'm not going anywhere, Peter." He was 23 the last time a woman had said something to him that had settled into him the way those words did. He had been a different kind of man at 23, less careful, less armored, not yet in the habit of keeping the most important things at a distance to protect them. He had learned the armor the way most people learn armor, by needing it and finding that the world would not provide it otherwise. But here was Maude Brooks telling him without fanfare and without any apparent interest in his reaction that she was not going anywhere, and the armor, it seemed, was not as complete as he had believed. He said, "Good." And that was all they said about it that night, but it was the beginning of a different kind of knowing each other. August was the month that things became something else. Not suddenly, not with any single event that could be called the turning point, but in the way water becomes steam, by enough heat applied steadily long enough that the thing simply changes into what it was always going to be. Maude came to supper twice a week, and then 3 times, and it stopped feeling like a visit and started feeling like a natural arrangement, the way things settle into the shapes they were always meant to hold. Clara counted the days between Maude's visits and reported the count to Peter in the mornings with a precision that he found both touching and slightly transparent. Deke met Maude for the first time at the end of July and said afterward, with the considered gravity of a man delivering a formal verdict, "She is all right." Peter took this as the high praise it was. On a Saturday in the middle of August, Peter saddled 2 horses and told Clara she was spending the afternoon with Mrs. Avery and drove to the schoolhouse and knocked on the door. Maude opened it and looked at the 2 horses and looked at him. He said, "Will you ride with me?" She said, "Give me 5 minutes." She changed into her riding clothes and came out with her hair down and her hat on, the one with the hole in it that Clara had pointed out on the first day, which she had apparently decided to keep as it was, and she swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who had ridden since childhood, which she had, and they rode out together onto the open plain. They rode for a while in the direction of the low hills to the north, the land opening out around them in the particular generosity of Kansas in summer, enormous and green gold and sky huge. The wind was soft. The horses moved easily together. They talked and then they did not talk, and both were comfortable. He showed her the place along Bluff Creek where the cottonwoods grew thick and the water ran clear even in summer. They stopped and watered the horses and sat on a flat rock above the bank and watched the creek run, and he was very aware of her beside him, the length of her arm near his, the way the light caught the side of her face. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What made you come to Caldwell, specifically? You could have stayed in Abilene." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is actual thought rather than avoidance. She said, "My father died and I did not want to be somewhere that was full of what he used to be. I wanted to be somewhere I had not known him, where I could be sad about him without being surrounded by his absence in every room." She paused. "That probably makes me sound like I was running away." He said, "It sounds like you knew what you needed." She looked at him. "Most people would call that running." He said, "Most people have not had to rebuild something from scratch. You have to go somewhere else to start building. That is not running. That is choosing the right ground." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the water, and he watched her take in what he had said with that particular stillness she had, that ability to receive things fully and let them settle. She said, "I think I chose the right ground." He took her hand then, which he had not planned but which felt, at that moment, like the most natural thing that had ever happened to him. Her hand was small and capable in his, slightly roughened from work, and she turned it over and held his back, and they sat by the creek with the cottonwoods moving overhead and the horses cropping grass at the bank, and said nothing for a while, because nothing was what the moment needed. On the ride back, she said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about you since the day I walked into Henderson's store." He said, "I have been thinking about you since roughly the same moment." She said, "You are very good at not showing it." He said, "I thought you needed time." She said, "You needed time." He said, "That also." She smiled at the plane ahead of them, and he watched the side of her face, and the way the late light moved on it, and he thought that he had not known it was possible to feel this careful about anything, this deliberate, this aware of every increment of a thing as it was actually happening rather than only in retrospect. They collected Clara from Mrs. Avery's in the early evening, and Clara climbed into the wagon and looked at the two of them with an expression that was entirely too knowing for 7 years old, and said, "Did you have a nice ride?" And Maude said they had, and Clara said, "Good," and settled against Peter's arm with her doll as they drove home, and the three of them were quiet together on the road in the evening, and it was the best kind of quiet. September came, and with it the beginning of a new school year, and Caldwell settling into its fall rhythms, the trail drives tapering off, the weather cooling at the edges of the day, the mornings coming sharp and gold, and the evenings turning purple dark earlier each week. Peter's horse sales had gone well. He had delivered 40 horses to 2 different outfits over the summer, and was in better financial shape than he had been in some time. Deke was making new predictions about a hard winter, which Peter treated with the usual skepticism. Clara, it was now clear to everyone who had known her in the preceding months, was better. Not healed, because grief does not heal in the way a cut heals, with new skin sealing everything over, but better in the way that a person who has learned to carry something heavy gets better at carrying it, grows the muscle for it without losing the weight of the thing itself. She laughed more. She ate more. She still had nightmares sometimes, but she had started coming to tell Peter about them in the morning rather than keeping them as private catastrophes, which was, in his estimation, the most significant change of all. She talked about her mother with Maude in a way she did not yet talk about her with Peter, which he understood was not because she loved him less, but because Maude had space that he did not, space that had not been Ruth's and was therefore easier to fill with her. He was grateful for it. He watched Maude with Clara on those evenings, the way she listened to a 7-year-old's careful recollections about her mother's hair and her mother's singing, and the way her mother had made biscuits that were better than anyone else's biscuits. And he thought, here is what patience actually looks like. Not the absence of urgency, not mere tolerance, but the active and genuine interest in someone else's interior world, the willingness to sit inside it with them and not hurry them back out. He had not known before Maude that a person could be like that. He had not known that patience could feel like this, not like waiting, but like arriving. He asked her to come to dinner on a Thursday in late September, just her, with Clara already spoken for at Mrs. Avery's for the evening. He cooked properly, which for Peter meant applying himself to it with the same focused attention he gave to anything that mattered, which meant the chicken was good and the bread was good, and the kitchen smelled like things that had been taken seriously. She arrived in the blue dress that he had not seen before, the one that was the color of evening sky, and her hair pinned up but softer than usual, and she looked at the table he had set and looked at him and said, "Peter, this is very fine." He said, "Sit down before I lose my nerve." She sat down. They ate. They talked, easy and deep, the way they had learned to do over these months, ranging across the world and back, from her childhood in Abilene to his early years on the trail before the ranch, from the particular politics of the school board to the various theories Deke maintained about winter and their consistent failure. She told him that her mother's people had come from Tennessee, and that she had a grandmother still living there who wrote letters in handwriting so fine it required good light to read. He told her about his own mother, who had died when he and Ruth were young and who he remembered mostly in impressions, the smell of her, the sound of her voice reading, the weight of her hand on his head at night. After dinner, they sat on the porch again, and the night was clear and cold-edged the way September nights are. And he had his pipe and she had her hands around a cup of coffee, and the stars were thick and low and the plain was silver and enormous. He said, "Maude." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that however you answer it, I am asking it because you deserve to be asked, not because I expect anything in return." She was quiet, waiting. He said, "I know that this situation is complicated. I know that I come with a 7-year-old girl who has nightmares and pulls buttons off dresses and names horses Buttercup, and a horse ranch that is modest at best, and a hired hand who thinks he can predict rain, and a fair amount of my own particular difficulties that I am still working through." She said, "Peter," he said, "let me finish. I know that none of that is simple, and I know that you are a woman of considerable capacity who has choices, and I would not for a moment assume that I am the obvious choice to anyone." She said, "Peter," he said, "I am saying that I love you. I have been saying it in all the wrong ways for months, and I am saying it plainly now. I love you, and you are the best thing that has come into our lives in longer than I can account for, and I would very much like to know if there is any chance that you would consent to stay in it." The silence after he stopped speaking was brief. Maude put her cup down on the porch railing and turned to him, and in the starlight and the cold September air she looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and said, "I love you too. I have been failing to hide it since June. I am fairly certain Deke knows." He said, "Deke definitely knows." She said, "Clara definitely knows." He said, "Clara has known for longer than either of us." She laughed, that unguarded full laugh, and he reached over and took her hand, and she leaned in and rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time in the September dark, her head on his shoulder and his hand holding hers, and the plain going wide and quiet all around them. And he thought that this was what arriving felt like. The actual arriving, not the traveling toward something but the being there. And he had not known until this moment how much he had needed to arrive somewhere. He kissed her for the first time standing at the gate when she left, in the moonlight with the horses moving in the far pasture and the smell of autumn in the air. A brief and very serious kiss that contained all the months of careful approach and all the intention he had accumulated, and also something wordless and warm that was simply them. Simply this. Simply the two of them on an ordinary night in Kansas making the single best decision of both their lives. She walked to her horse with her hand still touching his and looked back at him once from the saddle, and he watched her ride down the road until she was gone into the dark, and he went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the lamplight feeling like himself again, feeling like the version of himself he had misplaced somewhere along the way and was only now recovering. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that he had not associated with his life before, a kind of bright, inhabited quality, as though the rooms he moved through had all been improved by light. He and Maude were together most evenings, and the arrangement was natural and right, and Caldwell, which noticed everything, noticed this with the warm approval of a small community that likes its people to be happy. Mrs. Avery told anyone who would listen that it was about time. The blacksmith's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Aggie Pierce, told Maude directly that Mr. Dawson had been grieving his sister and his lost footing as a man, and that anyone could see he needed someone to help him find it, and that she was glad it was someone sensible. Maude received this assessment with the particular grace she had for receiving things, which was to take what was true in it and leave the rest. Clara needed no persuasion. Clara had been conducting what amounted to a quiet, long-running campaign for this exact outcome since approximately March, with the subtlety of someone who is 7 years old and believes herself to be invisible, which is to say not subtle at all. She received the news that Peter and Maude were courting properly with a satisfaction, so complete it was almost solemn. In October, a letter arrived from Cal Whitmore. Peter sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time before he opened it, because he knew what it might say, and he was not ready for any of the things it might say. He opened it eventually in the morning light with Clara at school and Deke in the barn. Cal was in Wyoming now. He had found work on a big ranch north of Cheyenne. He was doing better. He wrote that he had been thinking about Clara and that he was grateful to Peter for taking care of her, and that he understood if Peter had feelings about how things had gone, and that he did not blame him for having them. He said that he was not writing to take Clara back, because he knew she was in a good home and settled, and he was not in a position to give her what she needed. But he asked if Peter would let Clara know he thought about her, and that he was sorry for how things had gone. Peter read the letter twice and then sat with it for a while and thought about Ruth, and about Clara, and about the kind of grief that makes a man disappear from his own life rather than face it. He did not think kindly of Cal Whitmore. He did not think it was entirely right to disappear on your child because your own pain was too large to manage. But he thought about it from every angle he could manage, and he recognized, without excusing anything, that grief is not predictable and that some people do not have the resources to stay when staying is the hardest thing. He wrote back. He wrote that Clara was well and growing and that she was a good girl and that she looked like Ruth. He said that he would tell Clara that her father thought of her when Clara was old enough to receive that information, which he felt she was not quite yet. He said that he expected Cal to be in better contact going forward, and that Clara deserved to know her father, and that he was willing to make that possible when the time came. He sealed the letter and mailed it and told Maude about it that evening. She listened to all of it. She said, "You handled that with more generosity than most men would." He said, "I am not certain I handled it with generosity. I think I handled it with resignation. There is a difference," she said, "maybe. But you thought about what was best for Clara, not what would be most satisfying for you. That is something, Peter," he said. "I want better for her," she said. "You are giving her better every single day." He looked at her in the lamp-warm kitchen and thought about how thoroughly she had changed the landscape of his days, how entirely differently the world looked with her in it, and said, "So are you." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and they sat like that, and the autumn wind pressed against the windows, and the house was warm and full in a way it had not been, and that was enough. In November, Peter asked Maude to marry him. He did not make a large event of it. That was not his manner, and it would not have been hers either. They were walking back from the church social, the three of them, Clara between them holding both their hands and swinging their arms in the way she had taken to doing, and the night was cold and clear, and the main street of Caldwell was lit by lamplight from the storefronts, and the smell of wood smoke was in the air, and he stopped walking and said, "Maude." She stopped too, and Clara, who was still holding both their hands, looked up at him. He said, "I know we have not been courting long in the formal sense. I know that a reasonable argument could be made for more time." He looked at her. "I do not want more time. I know what I want, and I have known for longer than I have been willing to say it, and I am asking you to marry me. If you need more time, I will wait. But I do not want to wait," Clara said. "Say yes, Miss Brooks." Maude looked down at Clara and then back at Peter, and her eyes were bright in the cold night air, and she said, "Yes." Clara made a sound of pure satisfaction and swung both their hands again, harder than before, and said, "I knew it," with such conviction that Peter laughed out loud, which was a sound that had been coming easier and easier in recent months, and Maude laughed too, and the three of them walked home through the cold, clear November night with their breath in the air and the stars overhead, and all of it settled, all of it decided, all of it right. They were married in January. The winter of 1879 had come on hard, as Deke had in fact predicted this once, correctly, and to his enormous personal satisfaction. The church was cold, but the congregation was warm, every bench full, because Caldwell was a town that turned out for a wedding, and Peter Dawson getting married after 8 months of visible and somewhat agonized courtship was considered an occasion worth attending. Clara stood beside Maude in a new blue dress that Maude had made herself, with her hair in two neat braids, holding a small bunch of dried flowers because there were no fresh ones in January in Kansas. She was the most serious witness the occasion had ever produced, giving her full attention to the minister's words, with the gravity of someone who understands that an important event is occurring and intends to be present for all of it. Peter stood at the front of that cold church in his good coat, the one he wore to significant occasions and then hung back up with great care, and watched Maude come down the aisle on the arm of the minister, who was deputizing for the lack of family. And he thought that he had not known, 8 months ago when a woman walked into Henderson's general store with 2 carpet bags and a hat with a hole in it, that this was what was coming, and that he was glad. With a completeness that reached all the way to the back of him, that it was. She stood beside him and she looked at him and she was smiling, that quick, genuine, slightly surprised smile, and he thought, there it is. That is the whole of it. That is what I was looking for without knowing I was looking. They said the words. He put the ring on her finger, a simple band that he had ordered from the jeweler in Wichita, and her hand was steady in his. When the minister said they were married, Clara exhaled in a long, theatrical breath of relief that made the entire congregation laugh, and the whole cold church was warm for a moment. And outside the Kansas wind moved over the plain as it always did, indifferent and enormous. But inside everything was decided and right and done. They had a wedding supper at the church hall afterward, with Elroy Biggs on the fiddle again, and several other musicians who had appeared with instruments, and people danced on the swept wooden floor, and the children ran between the tables, and Deke got slightly into the apple brandy, and delivered a toast that was entirely incoherent but clearly affectionate, and Mrs. Avery cried happy tears and hugged Maude for a long time, and Peter danced with his wife. Which was a word he was going to have to practice because it felt, in the best possible way, entirely new. He danced with Clara too, lifting her up and turning her around while she shrieked with laughter, and then Maude took her and danced her around the floor in wide, swaying circles until Clara put her head down on her shoulder, and her eyes got heavy, and Peter watched his niece fall asleep in his wife's arms in the warm, noisy, lamplit hall, and felt something so complete inside him that it did not have a name, only a quality, like the feeling after rain. They settled into married life with the easy rightness of people who have known each other long enough to skip the awkward introductory period and move directly into the real thing. Maude moved into the ranch house, bringing her 2 carpet bags and several boxes of books, and a cheerful practical ability to make a space better without making it unrecognizable. She put new curtains in the kitchen. She found a second lampstand that made the evenings lighter. She did not change the room arrangement or the arrangement of Peter's books or any of the things that were specifically his. She added to rather than replacing, which was, he thought, entirely characteristic. Clara had Maude in the house now, which changed her daily life in ways that were visible and immediate. She had someone to braid her hair in the mornings, which she accepted with a solemnity that suggested it had been a private longing for some time. She had someone to talk to about the complicated social geography of 2nd grade at Caldwell School, which Peter had been quite literally unable to navigate. She had someone who knew when to listen, and when to redirect, and when to simply sit beside her with a hand on her back and say nothing at all. The nightmares continued to diminish. By spring they were occasional rather than regular, and when they happened, Clara would sometimes come to find Maude rather than Peter, and sometimes Peter and sometimes both, and whoever she found was there, and the house held her, and she was not alone in it anymore. In February, Maude caught a cold that kept her in bed for 3 days, which was the first time Peter had ever seen her still for more than 10 minutes, and he discovered that his wife accepted being cared for with considerable reluctance and a negotiating skill that would have impressed a cattle drover. She agreed to stay in bed only on the condition that he described to her what was happening outside the window every 2 hours, which he did, dutifully, reporting on the weather and the horses and Deke's activities, and once a hawk that landed on the fence post for an unusual length of time, which she declared worth the cold. Clara made her a picture every day for the 3 days, which Maude kept by the bed and looked at regularly. And on the 3rd day, when Maude came back to the kitchen table for breakfast, Clara stood behind her chair with her arms around her neck and said, "I am glad you are not sick anymore," with a directness and simplicity that meant everything there was to mean. Maude held Clara's arms against her chest and said, "So am I, my love." Spring came, and with it the particular renewal that spring on the Kansas plain carries, the grass coming back green and urgent, the sky enormous and open, the air losing its edge. The ranch was busy with the spring work, new foals and the fence repairs and the trail outfit contacts, and Maude was busy with the school, the 3rd school year of hers in Caldwell now, and the house ran with the productive rhythm of 2 capable people who had agreed on the same direction. In March, Maude told Peter she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before Clara was up, the kind of morning that is still gray-edged and quiet, and she said it plainly, the way she said most things, looking at him across the table with her steady eyes. He put his coffee cup down and looked at her for a moment and then came around the table and took her face in his hands and said, "Are you well?" And she said she was, and he stood there holding her face for a long moment looking at her and said, "Good. That is very good," and it came out rough-edged, the way things do when you are trying to say something larger than what you have room for. She put her hand over his and said, "We should tell Clara." They told Clara at breakfast. Clara set down her spoon with great deliberateness and said, "Will it be a girl or a boy?" Peter said they would not know for some time. Clara thought about this. She said, "I would like a boy. All my cousins on my mama's side are girls and they do not like horses." Maude said, "Boys and girls both can like horses." Clara said, "Then I would like a boy who likes horses." Maude said, "I will see what we can do." Clara went to school and reported the news to her closest friend, a girl named Anna Reese, and by afternoon half of Caldwell knew, which was entirely predictable and also entirely fine. The pregnancy was straightforward, which Maude took as information rather than expectation, continuing her teaching through the spring term and into early summer with a calm practicality that impressed nearly everyone and slightly alarmed the school board, who had not considered the possibility of a pregnant schoolteacher as a configuration they were prepared to manage. Maude managed them with the same measured efficiency she managed everything, addressing the concerns of the board's chairman directly and without excess and returning to her classroom. Peter watched her manage the world with the same feeling he always had watching her, which was a combination of deep admiration and a certain private amusement at the people who occasionally underestimated her. He thought about the woman who had walked into Henderson's store in April of 1878 with a carpetbag in each hand, and he thought about who she was now in his house and in his life and in Clara's life, and he could not fully account for the distance between the world as it had been and the world as it was, only that she was responsible for most of the difference. Summer was large and hot, and the plains went gold, and the cattle drives pushed through Caldwell in their seasonal numbers, and Peter sold horses and fixed fences and came home to Maude in the evenings, and those evenings were the best part of every day. Clara turned 8 in July, and Maude organized a birthday that involved 3 of Clara's friends and a cake with actual icing, and a small party in the yard in the long summer evening. And Clara sat in the middle of all of it with the expression of a child who has arrived somewhere she was always meant to be. She blew out the candles on the cake and was asked what she wished for, and she said, with the completeness of a person who no longer needs to wish for the main thing, a fast horse. Peter got her a puppy instead. It was a small, ridiculous, brown and white dog of no particular breed that had appeared in Deke's barn and whose mother was nowhere evident. Deke had named it Useless, which Peter felt was a name that would not serve either the dog or the child, and told Clara she could rename it. Clara named it Chester, which Deke accepted with dignity. Chester became, within approximately 10 days, entirely Clara's, following her through the house and to the yard and watching the porch steps with devotion while she was at school. He was a small bright point of chaos in the house, and Peter, who had not intended to have a dog, found that he did not mind it in the least. In late August, two things happened close together. The first was that Cord Fletcher, the reading temporary hand who had stayed on through the spring and summer, asked Peter somewhat formally if he might consider him for a permanent position. Peter said yes without deliberation, because Fletcher was good with horses and reliable and had proved himself over the preceding months, and also because the ranch had grown enough that the work warranted it. Deke received this news with the subdued approval he gave to things he had already decided he liked. The second thing was that Peter received another letter from Cal Whitmore, this one more settled in tone than the first, more present tense. Cal was still in Wyoming. He had a steady position now. He asked after Clara again, and this time Peter brought the letter to Maude and they talked about it for a while, sitting at the kitchen table, and they agreed that it was time for Clara to know that her father wrote and thought of her. They told her carefully on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch together. Clara listened with her particular intense stillness, the way she always listened to things that were important. When they were done, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Is he coming back?" Peter said, "Not right now, he is working far away." Clara thought about this. She said, "Can I write to him?" Peter said, "Yes, if you want to." Clara said, "I think I want to." She paused. "I want to tell him about Chester." Peter and Maude exchanged a glance over the top of Clara's head, and it was the kind of glance that contains a whole conversation, and both of them felt simultaneously the fragility and the strength of this child who was piecing her world back together one careful piece at a time, and the privilege of being present for it. Clara wrote the letter herself, slowly and carefully, about Chester and about Buttercup the horse and about second grade, and about Miss Brooks who was now Aunt Maude, and Peter wrote a brief note at the end confirming the health of all, and they sent it to Wyoming. A reply came 6 weeks later, short but genuine, and Clara read it 3 times and then put it in the box she kept under her bed with her important things, and that was all she said about it, which was enough. The baby came in November. His name was Robert, which was the name of Maude's father, and it was decided between them on an evening in October when the leaves were coming down from the cottonwoods along the creek, and the air had that particular cold, clean quality that only October in Kansas has. Peter had said, "Your father's name," and Maude had looked at him with the expression she had when something reached her fully and said, "Are you certain?" And he said, "Yes," and that was that. Robert James Dawson arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November with a great deal of noise, and the full attention of a midwife named Mrs. Pryor, who had delivered most of the children in Caldwell over the preceding 15 years. He was large and healthy and entirely bald, and he screamed with an energy that suggested he was going to be heard in this world whether the world was ready for it or not. Peter held him in the first 5 minutes, standing in the bedroom with the cold light coming through the window, and looked at this new person in his arms, this person who was new in every sense, and felt something break open in him that he had not known was closed. Maude was exhausted and radiant in the way women are after doing something that takes every resource they have, and she looked at Peter holding Robert and said, "He looks like you," Peter said. "He looks like a very indignant potato." She laughed and Mrs. Pryor shook her head and Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, having apparently come downstairs with Chester at her heels despite being told to sleep, and said in a low, breathless voice, "Is it him? Is it Robert?" Peter turned and showed her, and Clara came and stood at his elbow and looked at Robert with enormous, careful eyes and said, "He is very small." Peter said, "You were this small once." Clara said, "I was not." Maude said from the bed, "You very much were." Clara continued to study Robert with the deep seriousness she brought to important things, and then she looked up at Peter and said, "I like him." Peter said, "Good. You are stuck with him." Clara thought about this with what appeared to be satisfaction and said, "I am going to teach him about horses." And Chester put his paws on the edge of the bed and tried to see what was in Peter's arms, and Maude said, "Get that dog off my bed." And the room was full of all of them, warm and crowded and exactly complete. The winter that followed was the first winter Peter could remember that did not feel long. It was cold, genuinely cold, and the plains went gray and white, and the wind was serious business, and the work of keeping the ranch running and the family fed was considerable. But the house was full in the evenings, genuinely full, with Clara doing her lessons and Chester sleeping in front of the stove and Robert asleep in his cradle, and Maude reading or sewing, or sometimes just sitting across from Peter in the lamplight doing nothing in particular. And the sound of the wind outside made the inside warmer, made the lamplight more specific, made the warmth of all of it more felt. He watched her sometimes when she did not know she was being watched, and he was still slightly disoriented by the fact of her, by the complete and ordinary fact that she was here, in his house, with his family, with the child she had given him and the child she had helped him keep, and that all of it was real and daily and permanent. He told her this one evening in February, with Robert asleep in the cradle and Clara upstairs and the stove ticking with heat and the dark pressing the windows from outside. He said, "I find myself surprised still that this is actually how things are." She looked up from her sewing and said, "Surprised in a good way," he said, "in the best possible way. As in, I know this is real and I still do not fully believe my luck." She set down her sewing and looked at him across the room and said, "Peter Dawson, you are not lucky. You earned this." He said, "I do not know that I did." She said, "You stayed when it was hard. You took Clara when you were overwhelmed and did not know what you were doing. You showed up every day for a little girl who was breaking, and you did not leave and you did not quit. You earned this." He said, "You were the one who," she said, "stop. Take the thing I am offering you. You are good at refusing compliments, and I have been watching you do it for 2 years, and I am tired of it." He looked at her with the specific expression he had for when she surprised him, which she did regularly and which he counted on. He said, "All right." She said, "Good." He got up and went across the room and sat beside her on the settee, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the lamplight with the wind at the windows and the sleeping baby and the dog dreaming by the stove and the whole warm, particular, daily reality of their life around them. He said into her hair, "I love you," she said. "I know I love you too." Outside, the Kansas plain was dark and wide and cold and enormous, stretching in every direction into a distance that had no clear end, the way the future looks before you have lived it. But the house was lit from inside, and inside everything was settled and known and cherished. Spring of 1880 brought the 3rd school year for Maude since coming to Caldwell, and it also brought the formal news that the school board had offered her the head teacher's position, which was a new position the town had decided it needed as the school enrollment grew with the growing population of Caldwell. She came home with the letter from the board chairman and read it to Peter at dinner, while Clara listened with her chin in her hands and her elbows on the table in a posture that Maude usually corrected, but tonight was too interested in reading to notice. Clara said, "Does this mean you are the boss of the school?" Maude said, "Something like that, yes." Clara said with great satisfaction, "Good. You should be the boss of the school." Peter said, "Congratulations," and meant it deeply and completely, because her work at the school was one of the things he admired most specifically about her, not as a quality in general, but as a thing she did and did well and cared about. And he had seen what she did for children who were struggling, not just Clara but others. The boy with the stutter who she drilled with patient private sessions until his confidence was as large as his intelligence. The girl from the Homestead family who came in behind her grade level and finished the year ahead of it. The ordinary, good, quiet, daily work of a teacher who actually meant it. He said, "This is the right decision. They know what they have." She looked at him, and the expression she had was the one he loved best, the one that was private and warm and entirely for him. And she said, So do I, he had not imagined, 2 years ago, standing on the porch with his pipe and the dark plain around him, trying to figure out what he was doing wrong with a 7-year-old girl who had stopped drawing pictures, that this was what was on the other side of that hard season. He had not imagined that patient, steady, clear-eyed Maude Brooks was 3 months away from walking into Henderson's store with her carpetbags and her hat with the hole in it. He had not imagined that the thing he needed most was not to figure out what he was doing wrong, but to find someone who could help him do more right. Robert rolled over for the first time in May, and Clara screamed for Peter from the parlor with such urgency that he dropped the piece of leather he was mending and ran in from the barn thinking something was wrong, and she was standing over Robert on his blanket on the floor with her hands clasped and her eyes enormous, saying, "He did it. He just did it by himself." And Robert, having done the enormous work of rolling over, was now lying on his back looking at the ceiling with a placid expression that suggested he was not fully comprehending the significance of the achievement. Peter crouched down and looked at his son and then looked up at Clara and said, "Well done, Robert." And Clara picked the baby up and the baby made a sound of protest and Chester came to investigate, and the whole operation devolved into cheerful noise. Maude came home at 3 o'clock and heard the story of the rolling over from Clara in full, sequential detail, and looked down at Robert in his cradle and said, "Very good, my love," and then looked at Peter and smiled, and he smiled back, and it was an ordinary moment, entirely unremarkable from the outside, and it contained everything. By the fall of 1880, the ranch had grown enough that Peter hired a second permanent hand alongside Deke and Cord Fletcher. The horses he was breeding now were going not only to trail outfits, but to some of the established ranches developing in the area as Kansas continued its shift from open range to settled land. It was good work, the kind that would sustain them not just through the immediate years, but through the long ones, the kind of work that was building something. Clara was 9, and was at that age where girls who have been through something difficult and come out the other side have a quality to them that is both older and younger than their age, a certain seriousness layered over what is still a child's essential buoyancy. She was good at school. She was very good at it, actually, in a way that made Maude say privately to Peter that she had a particular mind, the kind that liked to understand things rather than just know them. She was making a friend in earnest for the first time since her mother died, a girl named Nell Winters who had moved to Caldwell from Missouri with her family, and the two of them moved through the world with the particular absolute alliance of children who have found each other. She had kept writing to Cal Whitmore. The letters were not frequent, 4 or 5 a year, and they were practical and factual and not emotionally elaborate, because Clara, who felt everything deeply, managed her feelings about her father with a careful reserve that Peter respected even as it sometimes saddened him. Cal wrote back. He did not come to visit and Clara did not ask him to, and Peter thought that this arrangement, imperfect as it was what Clara had decided she could manage, and he trusted her to know her own limits. One evening in October, Clara came to the kitchen table after supper with a piece of paper and said she wanted to ask Peter something important. He put down the newspaper and gave her his full attention. She said, "I want to know if it would be all right with you if I used your name." He said, "My name," she said, "Dawson. I want to know if I can be Clara Dawson instead of Clara Whitmore." He looked at her for a long moment, this child who had come to him wrapped in a too-big quilt and not saying a word, who had pulled the buttons off dresses and could not eat green things and had nightmares that came like storms in the night, who was sitting in front of him now with her braids and her steady eyes and her careful, deliberate question. He said, "Clara, you can have whatever name you want. You are mine regardless." She said, "I know, but I want the name too." He said, "Then you shall have it." She nodded with the gravity of a matter resolved, and then she said, "Can I have a piece of that cornbread?" And the moment passed into the ordinary evening again, but it stayed in Peter long after she had gone to bed. It stayed in him like something solid and warm, like a thing he could put his hand on in the dark and know was there. He told Maude about it when they were in bed that night, with the autumn wind at the window and Robert asleep in the next room. Maude listened and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She loves you. She has loved you from the beginning. You just could not see it because you were too busy worrying about whether you were doing it right." He said, "Was I doing it right?" She said, "You were doing your best, which is the only version of right that exists." He said, "That is a reasonable answer." She said, "I am a reasonable woman." He said, "You are the most unreasonably wonderful woman I have ever known." She said, "That grammar is a problem." He laughed. She laughed. The wind pressed the windows. Robert made a small sound in the next room and then went quiet. The house settled around them, warm and particular and specific to them, to these people, to this life that had been built out of patience and time, and a willingness to show up even when showing up was all you had. The spring of 1881 brought wildflowers across the plain in quantities that made even Deke pause in his work to look at them, which Deke did not do for things he did not consider worth pausing for. The school year was ending, and Maude had already planned the summer curriculum additions she wanted to develop for the fall, the kind of forward thinking that Peter recognized as entirely characteristic of her, always one season ahead in her planning, always laying the groundwork before the ground was ready to be laid. Robert was walking by March, toddling across the kitchen floor with the determined, unreliable momentum of a person who has mastered the theory of motion but is still working on the practice, and Chester followed him everywhere, which provided a certain safety net in that whenever Robert sat down unexpectedly, the dog was there. Clara, who had developed a strong proprietary feeling about her brother, supervised his walking practice with an intensity that he appeared to accept as normal. Peter's mornings had a shape to them now that he found himself grateful for in specific and daily terms. He woke before the others, dressed in the dark, put the coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window for a while in the gray early light, looking at the plain and the barn and the horses in the near pasture. And it was the same view he had had for years, but it was entirely different because the house behind him was full, because in a few minutes Maude would come downstairs and pour herself coffee and stand beside him, and then Clara would come down with her hair still loose and her boots half on. And Robert would make his waking up sounds from the next room, and the day would start. He had not known how empty the previous version of this had been. Not because it had been without love. He had loved Clara and been present for her and done his inadequate, determined best. But the house had been a place he managed rather than a place he lived, and it was Maude who had changed that. Maude who had arrived with her carpetbags and her patience and her willingness to simply be present for whatever was actually needed rather than whatever was convenient, and made the house into a home. He thought about this on a morning in late April, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, the plain going green-gold in the early light, the horses moving in the pasture. Maude came downstairs and poured her coffee and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they looked at the morning together in comfortable silence. She said eventually, "I think I am expecting again." He tightened his arm around her. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Fairly sure. We will know by summer." He turned and looked at her face, this face he had been looking at for 3 years now and was still not tired of, would never be tired of, the clear eyes and the quick mouth and the steadiness that lived in her and radiated into every room she occupied. And he said, "Good. That is very good." She said, "You said that last time too." He said, "It was very good last time too." She smiled. He kissed her temple. Outside, the morning was opening up, the light coming faster now, the horses in the pasture lifting their heads to it, and from upstairs came the sound of Robert waking, the small vocal sounds of a child announcing the day, and then Clara's voice through the ceiling saying, "I have got him, Aunt Maude," and the sounds of her crossing the floor. Maude looked up at the ceiling and said, "She is going to be a wonderful mother someday." Peter said, "She learned from a good one." Maude looked at him with that expression, the private warm one, and said, "I am the school teacher. She had a mother already." he said, and she has you. She knows the difference and she values both, and so do I in June of 1881, by which time it was confirmed and Clara had been told, and had received the news with the considered enthusiasm of someone who had enjoyed the last experience of a sibling arriving and saw no reason this one would be different. Peter Dawson stood on his porch in the long evening light and looked at what his life was. The horses in the pasture. The barn Deacon Cord had repaired through the spring. The garden Maude had planted along the south side of the house, the tomatoes coming in red and heavy against the fence. The sound of Clara inside reading to Robert, her voice carrying through the open window, telling him something about explorers, Lewis and Clark and their dog Seaman, the same story she had first heard from Maude in the schoolhouse, passed forward now to the next person in line. He thought about the man he had been in the fall of 1877, standing on a similar porch with his pipe, and his failing, and his love for a little girl he did not know how to help. He thought about Ruth, who would have loved Maude, he was certain of it, who would have loved watching her brother learn to stop being so careful with everything that mattered. He thought about Clara pulling buttons off dresses and not eating green things and asking whether heaven was cold at night. And he thought about Clara 2 days ago standing in the kitchen saying, "Can I be a Dawson, please?" with the directness and trust that she had grown into. He thought about Maude walking into Henderson's store and naming herself without waiting to be asked. He thought about her in the schoolhouse with her lamp and her cold tea and her grating, and the way she had looked at him when she said, "I am not going anywhere," like it was a simple fact about the world, and she was only mentioning it for his information. He heard the screen door open behind him and she came out and stood beside him, and she had her hand on her belly in the way she did now, the absent, comfortable gesture of a woman in her middle months, and she looked at the same view he was looking at and said, "What are you thinking about?" he said. "You, walking into Henderson's store." She said, "That hat was a catastrophe." He said, "That hat was the best hat I have ever seen." She laughed. He put his arm around her. They stood together on the porch while the evening came down gold and wide over the Kansas plain, while the horses moved in the pasture, and the light changed on the grass, while somewhere in the house behind them, a little girl who had once been unable to speak to strangers was reading to her brother about men who walked all the way to the ocean and back. He had been raising his niece alone and failing, in the particular way that a good man fails at something he has no map for, doing everything wrong except the thing that matters most, which was staying. And Maude Brooks had come with her carpetbags and her patience, the kind that was not waiting but arriving, and she had shown him and Clara both what it looked like when a person decided to be present and meant it. He was no longer failing. He was no longer alone. The life around him, the ranch and the horses and the children and the man he was in the middle of all of it, was something he could look at plainly and without apology, and it was good, and it was real, and it was theirs. He turned and kissed her in the evening light, a proper kiss, the kind that has the weight of 3 years and a whole-built life in it, and she kissed him back with equal weight, and the wind came across the plain as it always had, as it always would, carrying the smell of grass and distance and everything that was still out there, still wide and unresolved and magnificent, and inside their arms was the only place that was finished and decided and entirely, completely home. That December they had a second son. They named him Arthur, for Peter's father, who had been a horse rancher like his son, and who had died when Peter was 19 and left him the land that he had built the ranch on. Arthur came in winter like his brother, in the cold and the lamplight, large and loud, and insisting on being noticed. Clara, 8 years older and with 2 years of sibling experience behind her, held him in the first hour with the competence of someone who had done this before and was pleased to do it again. Peter stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched Maude holding Arthur and Clara, sitting on the edge of the bed looking at him, and Robert toddling at Clara's feet holding the edge of the quilt for balance, and Chester lying at the foot of the bed having apparently pushed past Mrs. Pryor while no one was watching and the room was full of all of them, warm and crowded and perfectly specific, and he thought, this is the whole of it. This is what was on the other side. He came in and sat on the bed beside Maude, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and said into his neck, "We are quite a collection." He looked at their children, their particular, specific, beloved collection of children, and said, "We are the best collection I know of." Clara said, "Chester is on the bed." Maude said, "I know," Clara said. Mrs. Pryor said, Maude said, "Chester can stay." Chester, who had the instincts of a dog who knows when a ruling has gone in his favor, put his chin on Maude's knee and breathed with satisfaction. Outside, the winter pressed the windows of the house on the Kansas plain. The wind came off the prairie with its old, indifferent enormity. The stars were out and thick and cold and far. But the light in the windows was warm and specific, and inside the house everything was answered and everyone was there. And the life that had been built in this place, out of patience and grief and love and time, was complete and ongoing and entirely, gloriously alive.